Hello and welcome back. This is our Unit 2 review for art appreciation. So in Unit 2, we covered the visual elements and design principles, the conceptual artist's tools like line, shape, value, mass, texture, space, all of the things that we've studied so far, but also the design principles, how those visual conceptual tools are used to create an effective work of art, things like balance and focal point. So to start off, we want to remember that both lines and shapes can be categorized loosely into two big categories. Either they tend toward being more geometric, more regularized, more controlled, straighter edges, more measurable angles, things that look like they are geometric shapes that have specific names, such as the diagram to the left, or lines and shapes that are more biomorphic. They look like things from nature. They look like plants, animals, people. They have far more curve, more natural formations. So generally speaking, when we look at an artwork, it will probably tend toward one or the other, either a stronger, more dominant use of geometric lines and shapes or a more dominant use of organic lines and shapes. It's not to say that you can't have an artwork that mixes both, but usually one is predominant in the piece. When we talked about the use of line, we talked about its main function being showing the edges of forms, showing boundaries or edges. And so when a line encloses a two-dimensional space, we call that a shape. And so once we've done that, we're then creating the illusion that, or the possible illusion, that that shape that's been made is meant to represent something solid and actual in the real world. So on these examples that you're seeing now, there are simple linear drawings that don't show the surface contours or details or highlights or shadows. The linear aspect is the outer edge silhouette, and the forms have been filled either black or white. So in the top one, the image of the chairs, we can see that the negative space, the empty space, the non-object, has been represented by the white shapes, and the positive space, the positive shape, is what's been filled in solid black. So the chair leg, the details in the back of the chairs, those are all solid forms, and they're represented there in black. The diagram at the bottom right shows you an illustration created really as a cutout from black paper and glued to white paper. But on the left, you can see what looks like probably tulips or some other kind of potted plant in what looks like probably a small garden pot. And in the left-hand version, the plant and the pot are white against a black ground. So in that case, the white shapes are positive, the black is negative. And then on the opposite side, it's reversed. The white space now is the negative, the empty, and the black space, the filled shapes, are positive. The reason that we want to think about whether things are solid or background is really pretty important, because a lot can give us that concept. In this case, the background space behind the cartoon figure is pretty easy to distinguish from the space that's supposed to represent him, but the body doesn't seem believably three-dimensional. There's some simple things happening, like if you look at his shoes, one shoe overlaps the other, the thumb and donut slightly overlap his leg, so you get sort of a sense of three-dimensionality there. But compare that drawing to this one. It's the same subject, it's essentially the same exact style, but the addition of those highlights and shadows, that range of what we call value, really does create a more believable, stronger illusion that the thing is actually three-dimensional. Look at his shoes again, and you see not only overlapping, but you can see highlights on the tips of the shoes, and you can see cast shadows from the cuffs of the shoes, and even from one shoe to the other, there seems to be a bit of a shadow there as well. You can clearly see the shadow down his arm, down his pants leg. So the idea is that lines most important function is establishing these boundaries, showing us the edges or the silhouettes. But value's most important function is creating a more believable illusion that the object that we're looking at is in fact three-dimensional. So value is not just black and white, it's all of those steps of gray in between those two extremes. So we looked at a couple examples of what we call value scales, where the value changes from absolute white through all the different darkening grays to absolute black. And of course, it could go the other way too. But in this diagram on the left, we have our lightest values, the white into the lightest gray. And then on the right-hand side, we have our lower values, the middle gray down to the darkest, deepest gray down to black. So what we have here is a diagram that's sort of divided in half. If you look at the first several boxes, those are what we call the high key values. Try to think of it like music. If you associate the lighter values with higher notes, then it kind of makes sense. The darker values, if you associate with lower notes, then we've got low key values. So the examples at the bottom should be pretty easy for you to deal with. Then you've got mostly middle to very dark grays and blacks on the left-hand drawing, so that would be a drawing that uses mostly low-key values, and the majority of the drawing on the right-hand side uses middle gray to very light all the way up to white value, so that image would make use of more high-key values. We can create these value scales, though, with a variety of different approaches. Of course, what you just saw looked like either charcoal smoothed and blended, or perhaps black and white and gray paint, very smooth transitions. Here you can see we're making the transitions in a little more obvious, a little more mechanical way. At the top, you have an example of using lines to create changes in value through a process we call hatching. So there is essentially one set of lines. They're all essentially parallel one to the other, or very similarly parallel. We are putting more and more lines closer and closer together to make things look darker, and we're spacing the lines out and using fewer lines with more space between them to make an area look lighter. So hatching leads us to cross-hatching. Cross-hatching is not just one direction of line, but lines that cross each other in multiple different directions, but the same rule applies. The more lines, the more marks, closer together, the darker the area appears. And the same thing happens with stippling. We use stippling probably more frequently in pen and ink drawing than in pencil drawing, but it's definitely a good choice when you're trying to render something that has a smooth surface like human skin. Hatching and cross-hatching can imply more texture, more linear mark, can even look like wrinkles in skin, and so stippling is a little more common when you're working in pen and ink on smooth, trying to render smooth surfaces. We need to distinguish between outline and contour. So an outline really strictly is a line that describes the outermost edge, the outer edge of a silhouette of an object. But a contour line is one that starts to show you the three-dimensional volume of that form. So just for instance, in these sandals, there are some lines around the outside for sure. That's an outline right there. But if you look here, where this strap goes into the buckle and this end of it loops back up, we can see an additional line that's not on the outside edge, but starts to show the difference between this plane of the strap and this plane right below it that's a little bit narrower. So you can find tons of examples all throughout here. In these wrapped candy lollipops, you can see a line on the outside edge of the stem of the lollipop for sure, but these lines that go from the outside edge and go across the surface start to suggest the movement in the surface of the plastic wrap around the candy. So a contour line could start on the outside edge, but it's going to go across the surface and start to describe the volume or the idea of the three-dimensionality of that form. And we have a special kind of contour that we call cross contour. And in this case, the cross contour is pretty obvious. The lines are not really depicting natural folds, for instance, in the skin in this hand holding an apple. But you see the lines going across the meat of the thumb and into the palm and then across onto the back side of the opposite side of the hand. You can see the lines wrapping around the fingers. All of these are going essentially the opposite direction of the main thrust of that object. a good example of that are these drawings of bottles. They're mostly upright verticals, but the contour, or in this case cross contour lines, are moving across them horizontally. So even though those lines don't represent labels or textures, real things on the surface, the way that they're placed and the way they move in space creates the illusion for us that those objects are three-dimensional. You could think of cross-contour lines in a way as being similar to latitude-longitude lines on a globe. You can clearly see those being used here in this really cool drawing of these Converse All-Stars. As it goes across, the line is describing the backside of the shoe of the heel, but it's the very same line then that describes the movement across the surface of the shoelace as well. You can also see how the artist has really cleverly used thicker lines in places to suggest areas that are dark or shadow. You can see that in the cast shadow for sure. And then very thin lines show areas where there are things that are very light. We can look at cross contour also from the point of view of computer generated imagery. If you think about creating a character design for any digital format, whether it's gaming or animation, a lot of the design work comes down to believably structuring the outer surface of the figure before color and texture and the other aspects are rendered. So you can see on this figurine that there are lots of different details that are rendered by the cross contour going both vertically and horizontally around the figure to define it in 3 dimensions. We definitely talked about different types of lines. There's of course actual lines, which is what we've looked at primarily up to this point, but you want to also think about this example here, letter B, the implied line, and this implied line created by stopping and starting actual lines. We all perceive the same curve in this, and this first example, but there isn't really technically an actual line that does that. Your brain is filling in the missing information or is being guided by the little hints of information that are provided in this system of implied line. We also, of course, don't need to put a separate line to show the difference between these two sides of this image. It's describing the same curve we looked at, but that is created by sharing an edge. So it need not be just black or white. It could be two different colors or two different textures coming together. Sharing an edge would cause us to perceive a line that isn't really there. So we also want to think about the connection between these concepts that we've looked at in drawing and painting and in 2-dimensional art forms, and think about how they apply to 3 dimensions. So in red at the top left, you have a circle. It's got an actual outline around the outside edge. It's definitely not showing any contour. It looks pretty flat. So I wanted to stress this here, that when we are working on a 2-dimensional surface, we should be talking about shape. But the 3-dimensional equivalent of a shape is like that turned wooden surface that you see there, that spherical shape. That's obviously a photograph of something that's actually physically 3-dimensional. So the 3D equivalent of a 2D shape we refer to as a mass. And just like we can have positive and negative areas in a 2-dimensional drawing or in a 2-dimensional shape, we can also have solids and voids in 3-dimensional objects. So we refer to the empty spaces, the non-filled spaces, as voids or negative spaces in 3-dimensional objects or 3-dimensional masses. Definitely you've seen this a couple of times. We want to think about how 2-dimensional artists in particular are having to use their knowledge of how we respond physically to the natural world in order to create a believable illusion of it on a 2-dimensional surface. So one thing that's quite simple for us to pick up on when we're trying to imply weight, two shapes of the same type and the same color, we're going to perceive a larger one as being heavier than a smaller one. Shapes that are the same size, though, we're going to perceive ones that are filled in solid dark values or colors, or with textures, as being heavier than plain shapes of the same shape and same size. Same shape, same size, depending on where it's placed in a picture plane, can create the illusion of weight. Something that is lower in the picture plane is always going to seem heavier to us because of the experience we have of gravity, and something placed higher in the picture plane is going to feel as if it's floating or even is further away from us. We can bring balance, though, to things without making a design rigorously symmetrical. And symmetry can be a bit boring to the eye. So asymmetrical balance, you want to think about these as being objects maybe on a teeter-totter or on a set of scales. If you look here, we've got two small objects, the same type of shape and same color as this one larger object. So you can imagine them balance one another out. The same thing is happening here. A small, darker, or textured object can balance a larger plane object. We also looked at various illusions of spatial depth. Simplest one, of course, is just overlapping. Making one shape appear to cover another one up creates a sense of depth. We can increase that illusion by not only overlapping things, but making the objects that are overlapped smaller than the object in the foreground. And if we combine that with our knowledge of things being closer to us, perceived as closer if they're lower and further away if they're higher in the picture plane, we can combine those three ideas into this example where we have three-dimensional object, or the illusion of a three-dimensional object, overlapping a shape that gets smaller, overlapping another shape that gets smaller, but those shapes are also higher in space. It creates a more believable sense of actual depth in that last illusion. We definitely looked at perspective and linear perspective systems to create the illusion of three-dimensional space. An important discovery of a systematized way of doing it happens in the Italian Renaissance and makes their artwork not only more believable in terms of proportion on bodies, highlights, and shadows, but because the settings now behave in ways that our eyes understand in terms of an illusion of three-dimensional depth. It really transcends and creates a new sense of reality in these artworks. So the system itself is fairly simple. The horizon is your eye level. And when you are facing directly ahead at objects that you are parallel to, even if they're pretty far off to left or right or above your eye, if your eyes are in a parallel plane to the front of those objects, they will appear as if the angles that describe their side walls are receding away from you toward the same point, which should be directly ahead of you at the horizon, which is your eye level. We call those leading lines orthogonals. And the place where they seem to meet is the vanishing point, which is on the horizon line. So in a one-point situation, you are parallel to the plane that's facing you on the object you're looking at. This situation changes that completely. In this situation, you're not parallel to any plane of any of these boxes that are being drawn. You're looking instead at a situation where you are facing the part coming closest to you is the corner of each of these buildings or boxes. They're parallel to each other, so they're going to share their vanishing points, but they are not parallel to you. So if you think about looking at the corner of the thing, the left-hand wall is going to seem to recede toward a left-hand vanishing point. The right-hand wall will seem to recede toward a right-hand vanishing point. Hence, we call this two-point perspective. So if you were to look at a building in the real world, such as this photograph from campus, if you look at this parking structure, you can see from just looking at the top of this part of the building, you know that the roof line is flat. And yet it appears that the roof is descending to the left and to the right, and you don't really see any 90-degree angles on these doors and windows here. You're actually facing the corner of this building, which gives you the clue that you're in a two-point perspective. In this case, you're in a one-point perspective. You're facing directly ahead toward this wall at the far end of the hallway. And if you look carefully, the line where the wall meets the ceiling on both sides is definitely on an angle, and those lines seem to come together at a point at my eye level in the distance, and that lines up with this other division between the tiles and the ceiling and the light fixtures, this line as well. Even the tops of the doors line up with that. And we see another effect here as well. Obviously, people don't really shrink when they go far away from us in space, but you can see that the figure here seems to be much taller than the figure walking toward us behind him. So again, parallel lines appear to converge at a point on the horizon we call the vanishing point, and the objects decrease in size when the distance between the viewer and the object is increased. Things that are farther away look smaller. This example, even though this area has a curved awning, you can tell by looking at this section here, you're looking at the corner of a building and a sharp angle down to the left and another sharp angle down to the right. This is a two-point perspective. It's an interesting case because this photograph was taken essentially on Water Street. So Front Street is up a pretty steep hill. If you've ever tried to walk up this hill, you know how steep it can be. So the horizon, where your eye sees the sky meeting the ground, is actually not the horizon of your eye level, because I'm actually standing on the ground down here. My eye level is probably somewhere about in here. So remember that the horizon line is determined by your location, by where your eyes are in space. This image is a one-point perspective as well. You are parallel to this plane, to the plane with the door, and to this plane. And so the angles that we're seeing here are receding toward a vanishing point that's at our eye level at a horizon line back in the distance. Another two-point example, this one's pretty easy. You can clearly see you're looking at the corner of basically a square or cube-shaped building with an angle leading off to the left and to the right. So spatial illusion, when we don't have straight line things like buildings to deal with, can be a little bit harder to create that illusion in some respects, because we often think of filling a large space with a single color. For instance, the water is blue or the sky is blue. And obviously in this photograph, there's slightly different colors. But until you really start looking closely, you may not notice how much those colors actually change when the thing that you're looking at gets further and further away from you. If we think about this horizon line as being the furthest away point that your eyes can see, then you'll really notice that the value, the color, the level of darkness of the color of the blue in the sky really clearly gets lighter as it goes back toward the horizon. And in fact, the same thing happens with the water. It's much darker close to us and fades as you go back to the horizon. Let me put some white shapes on top of this photograph in sections just to prove that to you. Isn't that kind of crazy? Look at the top section of the sky is so much darker than this section of the sky down by the horizon, and even here in the water, same thing is true. Very dark below, much lighter as it goes further away from us. Also, you'll notice that the details are smaller. You could even argue that the colors of the blue are less intense. So as we deal with atmospheric perspective, the illusion of depth created through value and color, the details are going to be larger and darker closer to us, smaller and less dark further away, and the color will even be less intense. When we put spatial effects onto non-linear objects like human bodies or animals, you get the effect sometimes of things coming towards you in space on a two-dimensional surface. That can be quite hard to draw. So in this example, you see a famous illustration, the recruiting poster with the Uncle Sam character. His finger's pointing straight out of the image toward us. A lot of times when students go to draw this, though, they will actually draw the finger on a weird downward angle like this, because your brain knows that that pointer finger is long. But in order to create the illusion of it coming towards you, you have to use what we call foreshortening. The foreground element is larger than normal, and the length of the finger in this case is much shorter. You can see the effect happening for real here with a camera. It's not something an artist invents. It's something that your eye absolutely perceives in space. Here's the same thing happening. If you were to measure his arm from elbow to wrist on this arm and then measured the same space here, you'd see how shocking it is that this space is really tiny from elbow to fist. This finger is perfectly foreshortened. It's really kind of a bizarre thing. You barely see any length at all, but you do see the tip of the finger really quite large as it comes towards you. This is the basic concept that we're applying to these objects. A downward angle like this that doesn't shrink the length of the object makes it feel like it's more parallel to us. But here, where the foreground is larger, the background circular end of the cylinder is smaller, and the length overall is much shorter, is a much more convincing illusion that that angle, or that cylinder rather, is coming straight out of the screen toward us. We definitely looked at important concepts with color schemes. So again, you want to remember and be able to recognize your triads. The first triad, of course, is your primaries: red, yellow, and blue. Your second triad is your secondary colors: green, orange, and violet. And we have two triadic groups for a total of 6 colors that are our tertiaries. The tertiary is a secondary that has more of one primary in it than the other. So if orange is made from combining yellow and red, if I add more yellow than I have red, I will end up with an orange that should be called yellow orange. We always name the tertiary for the color, primary color, that is dominant in the mix. We also talked about the fact that on a color wheel such as this, we can look very easily at pairing colors into complementary pairs. The colors directly opposite one another function like extreme opposites in value: black and white, yellow and violet, orange and blue, and red and green are absolute opposites. And so when they are put side by side, they intensify one another. They become stronger when they are side by side. The opposite or complement of a primary is always a secondary color. We can also look at colors grouped this way. If I were to divide this image on a diagonal this way, all of these colors are side by side one another. We can call those an analogous group, and they're mostly warm colors. The colors below that line on this side, we could group together as the cool colors. So analogous colors are colors that are side by side. Of course, we can have analogous groups that have some cools into some warms, or several warms with a little bit of cool. Those will still look good together because they will adhere to that idea of being side by side on the color wheel. They'll kind of blend into each other nicely. And also, equally spaced colors tend to look good together. The primaries look great as a grouping. The secondary colors look really good together. And in fact, a lot of clothing companies will create color variations for clothing options. You see this in stores like the Gap or Old Navy, stores where they produce a lot of the same type of garment but with different color variations. You'll notice a lot of times that they will utilize triadic color schemes to create variations in those garments. So on the test, I'll be asking you to look for certain things. Now, in this case, on this left-hand side, you can pretty clearly see you've got red, yellow, and blue. So obviously those are your primary colors. But here, I've got those same colors, just darker versions. So remember that a darker version we refer to as a shade. It's the base hue with black added to make it darker. And here I've got the same 3, red, yellow, blue, but with white added to create tints. Remember also that your secondary colors, of course, are complements of your primaries. These are your secondary colors: orange, green, purple. And the same thing here. I've made a set that are darker by adding black. Those are my shades. I've made a set that are lighter by adding white. Those are my tints. So we've got our first tertiary triad on the left and our second tertiary triad on the right. I've got red-orange, so an orange that leans more toward red. I've got a violet or purple that leans more toward blue. And I've got a green that leans more toward yellow. So red, orange, blue, violet, yellow, green. As opposed to this grouping where I have my orange that leans more toward yellow, yellow, orange. My violet that leans more toward red, red, violet. And a green that leans more toward blue, blue-green. So you can see if you were just looking at those two sets, it should be pretty easy for you to pick out which of those groups is which. And again, I've got variations here, making them darker shades by adding black, making them lighter tints by adding white. Now, the main questions about are really on the test are going to ask you to identify color schemes by looking at various artworks. So this is a pretty good example of a monochromatic color scheme. It's all different tints and shades, lighter and darker, variations on violet or purple. So this is a monochromatic scheme. This one I would describe, if I was trying to name the colors, what I see primarily there would be yellows, reds, and oranges. Those are my warm colors. They are side by side on the color wheel. Those are analogous. In this example, there are mainly blues, purples, and greens. Those are also analogous, but they would be my cool colors. In these examples, I see yellows, greens, and blues, both in the ceramics and in the painting. Those are still analogous colors, of course. Yellow is warm and blue is cool, but yellow plus blue equals green. They are side by side on the color wheel, so they still do look good together, but they give us a little more contrast between that warm and cool. This is another example of an analogous color scheme, both in Rihanna's and in the design for computer wallpaper that you see there. You've got some violet or purple that also leads into red and into orange. So of course, red is one of the parents of purple or violet. So purple's on one side of red, orange is on the other. They look great together, and that's, again, an analogous color scheme. They're side by side, but it gives us a little cool with the purple and a lot of warm with the red and the orange. These are triadic examples, and in each case, on the left, you see mostly red, yellow, and blue. Those are your primaries. And on the right, you see purple, orange, and green. Those are my secondary colors. Those are triads, groupings of colors equally far apart on the color wheel. And obviously with these are photographs of natural things, but clearly the top image is reds and greens. The bottom image is blue and orange. The top image has a little green of the leaves showing, but it's mainly yellow and purple. Those are complementary pairs, colors that are opposite one another on the color wheel. Then we also talked about some other visual elements, such as the idea of texture. In the painting on the left by Hans Holbein, we talked about how you could imagine the texture of the fabrics of his hair versus the wood behind him, the paper, the metal, the glass. All of those things seem very believable to our eye. We can imagine what they would feel like to touch. That's an example of illusionistic or visual texture. On the right, none of us are fooled into thinking that that would feel like wood to touch it, but we see kind of an invented wood grain that gives us the concept of it. That's what we would call invented texture. Objectively not real looking, but we get the concept. This is a pretty extreme close-up of a painting, and I thought you could really clearly see here that we definitely have physical, actual texture in this painting. It's not all smooth. This is an example of impasto, a very thickly painted area, a heavily applied layer of paint we call impasto. We also talked about the difference between a pattern and a motif. So for our purposes, the best example of a motif is the example on the left. A regularly repeating pattern is a pattern. The example on the right does not have a pattern that repeats evenly, but you have elements that repeat in a similar-ish way. These plant forms almost look like they're making a regular repeating pattern, except this unit reverses, folds back on itself. And of course the butterflies are placed in random spots and they're different sizes. So this isn't a patterned area. This would be an example of using repetition to create a motif. This on the left would be an example of creating repetition to create a pattern. This is clearly a repeating pattern of a special type. We call this a tessellation. M.C. Escher's work very frequently involves this use of these tiles that fit one into the other, kind of replicate themselves for a rotating, in this case, rotating, repeating pattern. We talked about the concept of time and movement. Obviously, some artworks suggest movement, but others are actually capable of moving, and that's the case with these works by Alexander Calder. Calder's work is kinetic, meaning that it is able to move. When we think about organizing the visual elements to create a plan, so to speak, for planning out how our artwork is going to work, we want everything to look like it belongs together, and is harmonious together. And so one way of creating a composition or a layout, an arrangement of the elements of your image is to rely on symmetry or approximate symmetry. The textbook sometimes uses the term bilateral symmetry, meaning that there is a center line and that the shapes are essentially the same left and right of that center line. If you folded it, you'd have essentially the same things on both sides in terms of visual weight and shape of what is shown to you. Now, it's not to say that symmetry is bad. We like symmetry, but it can be a little bit of an obvious solution. So we often go for asymmetrical balance. So make sure you're aware of this. This does not mean that the piece isn't balanced. It's just balanced without it being symmetrical. So in this case, these small dark shapes, for instance, are balancing a large lighter shape. Small dark shapes balancing a larger lighter shape. A large empty area balancing a slightly smaller area filled with patterns. So these are all balanced. They don't feel like they're heavier on one side of the picture than the other, but they are not symmetrical. If I put a center line through the middle and folded them, I wouldn't have identical shapes, visual weight and size of shape on each side. One particular type of balance that's pretty easy to recognize is the balance we refer to as radial balance, as if things are radiating outward from center in equally sized, visually weighted shapes. And we also talked about the need of, or the idea of making the main aspect of the artwork evident to the viewer, and we can do that in a variety of ways. We refer to this as a point of emphasis, or more commonly as a focal point. Most artists, of course, are using a lot of intention when they make a piece. There are certain things they want you to look at. So these techniques are guiding your eye toward what we want you to see. So in the top example, the Last Supper, not only do we have the implied line of the line of sight of the disciples looking toward center, but if we were to extend the lines between the sections in the ceiling along the tops of these tapestries on the walls, those lines all meet at a vanishing point in a perspective system, one-point perspective system, that leads us right to the focal area. But we can also be led to a focal point through extreme contrast of directional lighting, this bright spotlight that leads our eye to this section. Notice that the focal point is not the dead center of the painting. The center is about here, but we're all of us looking in here. Part of that is implied line of sight of these figures looking inward. Your eye is primarily drawn there because of this directional lighting. Or here we can have more than one area of focus, and in this case that pale and rougher textured material of the plaster that makes up these two figures really contrasts with the bright, dark values of color behind them. These smooth and darker areas really intensely contrast with the white. We also talked about the issue of size, and we talk about size in a couple different ways. When we talk about sizes of scale, we're usually referring to something that seems proportioned to the way we expect it to be in the real world, but is rendered either much larger or much smaller. In this case, with Claes Oldenburg's work, they are objects that you recognize from daily life, but they are rendered at a much, much larger scale than you would expect. We also looked at the issue of proportion. Now, proportion is a measurement system in which we measure one unit of an overall figure or object in comparison to the whole. So in this, the proportions from classical Greece, from the Doryphorus figure by the sculptor Polykleitos, the head, if you were to measure the head's shape from the top of the skull to the chin times 7 would give you the overall ideal height for a Greek classical figure. We also saw a proportional system being used by Leonardo da Vinci in his rendering of the Vitruvian Man.